because 50 years ago, an Italian friend of mine invited me to Lyme, Regis. And the only reason why he invited me was because I had a car. And he lived in London. And he said, "You'll love it." He was a fossil collector. And this is what he presented me with when we came down for the weekend. I said, "That looks really interesting." And he was a bit of a genius with fossils even then. And once he'd shown me what there was to find, and I saw my first ammonite, I kind of forgave him. We stayed for the weekend at the Alexandra Hotel. Now, this was 50 years ago. I must tell you, it's not the hotel that it is today. Still very welcoming, but it was that evening in the lounge, which was, I still don't remember who the people were, but they were all locals in there for a drink. And the first story they told was about Mary Annie. Okay, neither he nor I had ever heard of her. And then before I left, I bought a postcard from reception, and this is the postcard. I still have it today. Now, this is the image that everybody knows about. And of course, we know that she wasn't that old when she did all her discoveries. She was in her teens and 20s. Ammonites, to me, at that stage, were absolutely an unknown. This is the ammonite that my Italian friend sort of dragged out of the rock over the next period of about 3 months. But to me, it was all about learning what these things were. I mean, with no knowledge in my mid-20s, somebody had to explain to me that this was actually the shell of an animal. Cephalopods, what the hell were they? And to me, it was really a learning process. It was Ammonites 101. And I had to learn that these shells actually weren't like the shells of seashells or the shells of garden snails. They actually had chambers in there. I heard the term chambered nautilus for the first time. And I realized that the ammonites and nautiluses we found were incredibly old. I guess almost 200 million years, they told me. But what I learned subsequently, of course, was the important function of those chambers. Now, I'm sure 90% of you know this inside out. But for the other 10%, what I learned then was that without these chambers, the ammonites and the nautiluses would never have got to this dominance in the sea. And remember also that the shells of ammonites were not always coiled. The early nautiloid shells were straight, and only eventually they coiled up. So you're going back 300, 400 million years, you're dealing with slightly coiled shells until eventually you end up with the true ammonites, totally coiled, and the truly coiled nautiluses. And that, to me, was all news. It was a fascinating story. 10 years after that, now I'd got into the ammonite thing, and it's all very interesting, but I was busy earning some money and so on. And I was at an antique shop in Portobello Road in London, and I found this. I had no idea what it was. It was stone. It was in a bucket full of stones, and a few ammonites, and this. I had to buy the entire bucket of stones. I'm sure today in Portobello Road, there's still sitting a bucket of stones on the pavement somewhere, because this is all I took home. And I discovered, reading a bit, that it was an uncoiled ammonite. Now, to me, without any knowledge at all, this seemed pretty weird, because it looked almost as if these shells were soft and you kind of can pull it up and you'd get a shape like that. Doesn't it look like that? I started reading about these things. I mean, my curiosity went berserk. And then I saw something like this. I had no physical objects to look at because I was reading about these things. And I started drawing, and I started imagining what these things would look like. And the first thing I realized was that if you had an uncoiled ammonite, you could actually tell if it was dextral or sinistral. Because I was a shell collector, and I knew that most shells are dextral. They turn to the right. And if you can find a sinistral shell, that would be worth something, like 1 in 10 million. And so I thought, well, now I can start looking at these uncoiled ammonites to see if they're dextral or sinistral. We'll come back to that. The other thing that confused me terribly, I bought a big shipment of ammonites from Madagascar. They're called Nostoceras. Some of them were still in the rock, so I prepared them. And I noticed that all of them were missing the early whorls. They were all broken off. Even the ones I got out of the rock, there was no early, all the little whorls, the early ones, were broken off. I mean, that drove me crazy. And I started saying, you know, why are they all broken off? What did they look like before they broke off? Because none of the specimens that I saw, even in photographs from Japan and Madagascar, none of them had the early whorls. So I presumed they were either coiled or turreted or went back inside the shell. We just had no idea. About this time, I started communicating with Jim Kennedy, who ran the Oxford Natural History Museum, and his South African colleague, who worked at the South African Museum in Cape Town, Herbert Klinger. Between the two of them, they had written more than 150 papers on mid-Cretaceous and late Cretaceous ammonites, both in Madagascar, the UK, and in South Africa. And I started becoming quite good friends with Herbie Klinger. And I asked him all these questions. 3 times I got kicked out of his office for being so stupid. This was the start of a good relationship. Between the two of them, they were my mentors in this game, because then I decided I wanted to go and find some of these things myself. I was living in South Africa, so this is where we started, on the banks of an amazing lake, a lake that is populated with dragons, Nile crocodiles, hippos, and so on. And I did this together with Herbert Klinger from the South African Museum. I discovered, because I asked him, you know, let's go fossil hunting. And he said, look, we've got no budget. He was 1,000 miles away from the nearest fossil sites. He says, I've got no budget, I can't travel, I can't do anything. So I decided I was still in business, so I said, I'll pay for you. You come with me, we go fossil hunting. And we did that for about 5 years. And so the park rangers had to be armed in order to guide us there. Also, there were elephants, and there were large electrified elephant fences that protected us from them. And especially on this beach, which was the destination for our primary heteromorph hunt. And as you can see, although we were able to get there by boat, we were protected from the beach with these elephant fences. So we had to dive underneath the fences to get to the beach, and then with our bounty, we had to return back under these electrified fences to the boat. And it was worth it, I must tell you. These were my expectations in the drawing, and we got pretty close. We at least found fragments of these very rare heteromorph ammonites on that beach. And we returned there 2 years later to find that the lake had gone. Now, for the first time ever, and never since has this happened, due to some particular climatic and local conditions, that this 350-kilometer lake was completely empty apart from a little patch in the middle. So we couldn't use our boat to get anywhere, but what we could do was simply walk into the lake and collect fossils. I know that Herbert Klinger collected cases and crated up cases of ammonites to go back to the South African Museum in Cape Town. And the variety that we collected were just spectacular. Also, on the edge of the lake were these giant bivalves. I had never imagined that I would see bivalves 2 to 3 meters across. It was absolutely amazing. Also near there was a harbor development which cut right through the KT boundary, or the old KT boundary, and we found some amazing fragments of giant heteromorphs. And I'll come back to that a bit later. Also there we found giant Pachydischus ammonites, which are now in a local museum at the harbor. So that's my curiosity satisfied. What's quite fascinating is the history of ammonites. As I said earlier, they started with straight-shelled nautiloids. They were straight-shelled, so you go back 400 million years. Those straight shells started coiling up, and they became nautiluses and ammonites. Now, in that period, you do find, as we talk 350, 400 million years ago, you find these ammonites, and people say to me, oh, well, that's a heteromorph ammonite. Well, when I wrote the book, I was very specific about that these were not heteromorph ammonites because these were nautiloids in the process of coiling up rather than uncoiling, which happened much later. But these, if you ever see these are the only ammonites, really, ammonoids that you can find that are in the same rock as trilobites. Let's just understand the basic variations that are possible with a fossilized shell or with a growing shell. Because here we have the mantle of the ammonite or nautilus depositing shell material almost in a circle. But if it varies by just a tiny amount, the shape of the shell could change. So a few molecules on the right or a few molecules on the left, every time you deposit something, will change the shape of the resulting shell that is built. And to me, the variety of formats that can be created just on this basic principle is absolutely amazing. And that, of course, is what happened to the heteromorph ammonites. You're moving from very simple spirals, which really have only one axis of coiling. They're two-dimensional to three-dimensional ammonites with many axes of coiling. So the one on the right, which is an American Didymoceras ammonite, starts off as a tiny little few millimeters of normal ammonite coiling. Then it opens up. So you see that red coiling at the top, so it's an open coil. Then it starts making a very tight coil around the green axis, and then eventually, when it's mature, it makes that enormous ridged body chamber where the animal lives. Okay, now that's a different way of growing, isn't it? And you can see from a complex structure like that, that probably it's very difficult to find a complete one. And that explains why they're not in many museums, because remember, museum collections are more than 100 years old typically. And in those days, they were collecting with a big hammer and chisel. Now we have the tools to get these kind of things out of the rock. So that's another reason why they're largely invisible sometimes. Now, I call this hook that heteromorph ammonites make at the end of their life, I call it a senile hook. Because, hey, that must be a really dumb thing to do. Because remember, living in that body chamber is an animal with long tentacles. And as it makes that hook, it gets increasingly unable to extend its tentacles. There are some examples that we've got where there's less than a centimeter between the end of the body chamber and the previous shell. So it's almost killing itself by closing in on itself, which is crazy. But of course, we know nothing about the actual animals. All we have are the shells. And we can't imagine how its lifestyle changed from the time it was a little whisk of an ammonite to being in this shape and form. There are so many species of these that exist. These are American examples, but the coiling is just spectacular. And we can only imagine how they lived. There's one particular one that I just wanted to show you. This is an example from Japan. This looks like a normal planing spiral 2D ammonite from Lyme Regis that has suddenly decided to grow a senile hook. And it looks like it's all in sort of 2 dimensions, isn't that right? Well, until quite recently, the Japanese scientists looked at this very carefully, and they looked at its early worlds, which were never preserved. In any of the big ones, I have this one on the right is in my collection. The middle is missing, like in a lot of local ammonites as well. But they found some little ones. And they found that in their early worlds, they're turreted. So they start off being turrets, then they suddenly go to being a normal ammonite. And they lose the turret. Really quite amazing. And inexplicable until you start looking at the detail. And then you get to these super complex spirals where they just seem to be a knot of senile hooks all together. This is particularly ammonites found in Japan and in eastern Russia. They are just this like a ball of chaotic material, but they are in fact following a particular mathematical formula that just repeats itself over and over and over again. When did these things live? Because you'd expect to find some around here, wouldn't you? Well, the interesting thing about it is that they lived in sort of 3 revolutions. What this chart from the Heteromorph book shows you is really the Triassic period from about 250 million years ago to the end of the Cretaceous when the ammonites died out. And don't worry about the complex names, but there you basically have 5 ammonite orders that encompass all the ammonites in the fossil record. And the purple ones are basically the uncoiled heteromorphs. And they occur in 3 separate revolutions. One in the Triassic, when they were very small, less than a centimeter long, typically. Then in the Jurassic, there are very few, and they occur, interestingly enough, in Dorset, right where we live, in northern Dorset, and also on the French coast, and I'll show you some examples of those. And then in the Cretaceous period, you can see this purple area in terms of number of species of uncoiled ammonites just explodes. And in fact, in the middle of the Cretaceous period, there were more uncoiled ammonite species than the total number of ammonite species alive. And the question is always, well, where do you find these things? Well, you find them wherever there are rocks exposed of that age. You may only find bits of them, but they were everywhere. There's actually nowhere in the world where you don't find them. But they are not easy to find because of their fragility. So I wanted to show you just a few of the British ones. So the Jurassic ammonites that uncoiled ammonites you may have seen are these, and the interesting thing is that in the same rocks you find the ammonites that they were likely derived from. So there's a coiled version and an uncoiled version, which in itself is quite interesting that you seem to have 2 species where you can actually see an evolutionary link between 2 of them. And in Folkestone and along the Kent coast and also on the French side of the channel, you have these beautifully pyretized, but not very long-lasting, uncoiled ammonites. I mean, they're quite beautiful, but they tend not to last. We've not really been able to maintain any of them for a very long time, unlike some of the pyrized stuff from the Jurassic coast. And up in the northeast, you have these uncoiled ammonites. This picture appeared on Instagram, surprisingly, just a few weeks ago, and it's probably the best preserved UK uncoiled ammonite from that area that I've ever seen. Fantastic. But they are very rare, and mostly just bits are found. And of course, you may, if you're on any of the social media, you may have seen things like this. The Isle of Wight and the uncoiled ammonites, I mean, they're starting to use it as a tourist attraction. There's the other variety that's very common in the Isle of Wight is this particular one. But these are big, heavy, difficult to prepare, and not very well preserved.
Let's then have a look at this diversity of the shapes of heteromorphs. The simplest, of course, are the scaphites. This one's found just down the road here in Lyme, Regis, in some Cretaceous deposits. And all there seem to be is a normal flattened ammonite with a senile hook attached.
In the Pierce Seaway formations in the United States, the preservation of these ammonites is absolutely spectacular. They can be polished down to expose those beautiful suture lines, the whole body chambers there, and on the other side, the entire shell is preserved. So just beautiful objects. And here, this is another one that's sort of classed an archetypal uncoiled ammonite. In other words, you see the spiral shape in the middle, and then you see sort of the extended senile hook all around it. What I wanted to point out here is that these are the two sides of one ammonite. Can you see if this is sinistral or dextral? Does it coil to the left or to the right?
Which way you looking at?
No, it's not. It depends on both sides. It coils the same way. It's dextral. It's like normal shells. All seashells generally coil to the right. In other words, if you put your right hand into its opening, then it's a dextral shell. If you can put your left hand into its opening, then it's a sinistral shell.
I was a shell collector for many years before this, and to me it was always really important to see if we could find sinistral shells, because most gastropods are coiled dextrally. And so if you could find a sinistral shell, it was always a big advantage. And when I started my interest in heteromorphs, and you could actually tell whether they were dextrally or sinistrally coiled, it became obvious that coiling was an absolutely random thing. And in my experience, 50% of the heteromorphs that we find are coiled dextrally, and the other 50% are coiled sinistrally. Many of the spiny heteromorphs have been restored, of course, and here's an example of a Japanese heteromorph where only one single spine has been fully preserved in the original matrix. There are some shorter ones that have also been preserved, but you can see that fossil restorers are very keen to replace those on their finds, just to give an indication of what these animals were like and how spectacular they were in real life.
And many of them, of course, got extremely large. Now, the fact that they're large in itself is not that interesting, but what is fascinating is how big the body chambers are. You know, with the last chamber where the animal lived, in most ammonites and nautiluses, it's around 50% of the total shell volume. In these uncoiled ammonites, the body chamber is 80 to 90% of the shell volume. So these animals grew to enormous size relative to the size of the shell. They must have been big, they must have had quite an appetite, and they were probably voracious feeders. And they probably had long tentacles like in this conceptual drawing that we did for the heteromorph book. And these guys were big predators in the ocean. And this really brings me to the object that was used in advertising this talk. Because there you also have ammonites with incredible preservation and beautiful spines. So let's have a little look at how these projects were developed. Heteromorphs are mostly found in Provence in France, in the Alps about 1,000 meters up. And the reason those deposits, those marine deposits are so high up, of course, is because the African and the European plates collided in the late Cretaceous, pushed the seabed up, together with all the fossils that were preserved at the bottom. So this is long after those fossils were deposited, they were pushed up, and they can now be mined, basically, while doing that. And this is some examples from our fossil hunts to find this particular one. And the other point I wanted to make is that these deposits are so fine, much like some of the blue lias deposits here. So the preservation can be fantastic. And all these, obviously you collect them in pieces because that's the way the rocks come out. Then they have to be glued together. Typically then the top has never got any spines on it because there's lots of erosion, but the bottom spines would be preserved if they fell into very soft mud. If they fell onto other ammonites that had fallen down previously, the spines would be crushed. So you have to have perfect situation where they fall into mud. And 5,000 hours later, you get this. So it's quite fascinating because not many people have tried things of this complexity. And Luc Ebel, who did this particular piece, when he finished, he made one statement. He said, "I will never do this again." And he hasn't. He thinks ichthyosaurs are much more easy to prepare and find. Another example is this site in Morocco, which was found about the same time, about 400 meters of exposed mountaintop, absolutely filled with uncoiled ammonites. The trouble was that there were no roads. So all the pieces that they collected had to be transported by camel to a local road, truck, workshop, and so on. And here are just some pictures of the work they had to do. After putting all these bits back together again, they started off cleaning the stuff, doing the rough work, and then a little bit more detailed work. And eventually, it was sold to a London fossil dealer, and they were all cut up, created beautifully, and then launched to acclaim to a wonderful audience with lots of champagne.
Finally, just a few words about the mysterious paperclip heteromorph Diplomoceras. I mentioned that Herbert Klinger and I had found several of these probably 6-inch diameter portions of the body chamber of Diplomoceras on the South African harbor site. Now, we kept wondering where we could find specimens of this that were together, because there's evidence everywhere that Diplomoceras lived all over the world. In fact, there are specimens from Alaska, from the United States, from Australia, from Japan, from South Africa, and even from the Antarctic. And in fact, it was in the British Antarctic Survey database that I found reference to a complete one that they had found.
On Seymour Island, which is just at the tiny little island on the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. And there they exposed the KT boundary, what used to be called the KT boundary, and there they found lots of ammonite material. And on their database, it said they'd found these Diplomoceras, and boy, was I keen. I couldn't find anybody who would talk to me about it. I wanted to see this thing that they'd found. And eventually I tracked down the individual who led that expedition in 1999. And he said, it must be there somewhere. I can find it for you. And in the meantime, here's a photograph of me with that Diplomoceras. So this is him lying in the ground in the Antarctic on Seymour Island, where they found this strange paperclip ammonite. Now, so we had just the body chamber, not the rest of it. Somehow the rest hadn't been packed, had got lost, had got whatever. But now the chase was on. Where could we find the other pieces of these ammonites somewhere in the world so we could make casts of them and actually create a complete version of these heteromorphs? Well, luckily in my collection I had a very small piece, which was actually the bit between the body chamber and the first part of the fragment cone. It was actually being studied by a university in the United States at the moment because it has two muscle attachments where the animal was actually attached to the body chamber. That's quite unusual. So we thought, well, let's see if that fits into the bits that we have from the Antarctic. And guess what? It fitted exactly in terms of size and so on. Absolutely perfect. Then we got some material during a visit to British Columbia in Canada from our good friend Rick Ross, who, if you're on social media, you'll see a lot of his stuff. And he donated a few bits for the fragment cone, which we needed because they were all left behind in the Antarctic. And then we found some other small pieces from in a New York museum, and eventually we got two of our friends, Peter and Eva, to make molds of all of these things and to create a model of the complete thing. And here it is, and it's now on display in the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge. So, I mean, what a bother. Why on earth would anybody do this? You know, it's absolutely crazy. But in the 8 or 9 years since, this model has become quite an interesting thing. The red arrow indicates where the fragment cone, where the chambers end, and everything from the right and to the bottom of that is the body chamber. So you can see again, 80 to 90% of the shell volume is body. So what about the purpose of the fragment cone to provide flotation? And we find this is almost consistent in all heteromorphs, is that they have these incredible body chambers. What we've said is they seem to lose their fragile chambers as they age anyway. So how on earth do heteromorphs use their fragment cone for flotation? It's a big question that we just cannot answer.
So let's finally look at the dilemmas that Darwin might have faced had he known some of the things we now know about heteromorph ammonites.
problem we have with the heteromorph fossil record is that there are no intermediate species. They just appear in most cases. Now, how does that happen? Could there be something like a sudden evolution? Well, now that we know a little bit about DNA, we know also that viruses can change genetic characteristics, and they can even do it in a way that is immediately reproducible to the next generation. There are even stress-related situations that can change DNA in humans so that they are carried on to their children. And let me tell you, to change an ammonite's shell structure doesn't require much change in the mantle of the animal. Because remember, the mantle of the animal builds the shell as it goes along, makes it bigger and bigger and bigger. And it takes just one little snitch, one little genetic change to turn a different way. Just a little percentage every day will create a different change. So we don't know the answer to this, and we probably never will. But the problem is that the only way we can explain the emergence of some of these strange heteromorph forms is that something happened to change the animal's shell production. And it happened quickly. What would Darwin have said about that? Remember, we said species can change over time in response to the environment. Well, here we have the opposite. Here we have sudden change that changes the shape of the shell to such a degree that the animals must have had to go and find another environment to be successful in. You know, if you were just a normal ammonite and you suddenly grew this strange hook, I would suggest to you that you probably needed to find a slightly different environment. So it's almost the opposite of, changing in response to the environment, but as you change as a result of something else, and then you have to go and find a new environment. So again, Mr. Darwin, could this happen the other way around? And then lastly, I think Darwin would have been absolutely fascinated to have discovered that nautiluses lived for almost 500 million years without ever changing their shell structure. They went through 5 extinctions, mass extinctions, they went through everything else, and they're still alive today without changing their basic design. Mr. Darwin, why is the only thing that survived that long? Why did it not evolve? No matter what the environment did to it.
What happened next, of course, was that many of these fossils ended up in my collection here in Dorset. And it's been such a pleasure to share that with our friends and contacts from all over the world. But looking back on the last 50 years, my life has really come full circle from that first acquisition of a postcard of Mary Anning through 50 years of fossil collecting and the documentation of that in my trilogy of books, to this book, Recreating the Young Mary Anning. My life has really been intertwined with Lyme, Regis, the Jurassic Coast, and Mary Anning, and for that I am truly grateful. Thank you for spending the time with me today.